share with you. I thought I'd start with talking about Milton Keynes. I won't talk about it for too long. Anyone that knows it or has worked in Milton Keynes, there's about 100 million facts about it, and you tend to fall in love with it as a place. So we're all a bit obsessed. But I'll start. So if I could share the slides, that would be wonderful. Brilliant, thank you. Great. So in terms of Milton Keynes, it's actually celebrated its 54th birthday last week. So Milton Keynes was the largest of the post-war new towns, and arguably the most ambitious and most successful. The borough-wide is predicted to grow to a population of 450,000 by 2050. So in terms of a growing new town, it is continuing to grow. Next slide, please, Miriam. Thanks. I think one of the most important starting points for Andy and co when they first were invited to work in Milton Keynes was really the sort of actual idea of a new town itself. So the building of something completely from scratch. Now, there is obviously within Milton Keynes, there are already historic towns and villages, but the actual new town itself incorporated them. And I think it's a really remarkable place for lots of different reasons. I'm not sure that we're whizzing through the slides at the minute. No, there we go. So, yeah, a new town built from scratch. So the images that you're seeing at the minute, obviously, is the fields, the farmland that was built upon, and then obviously a plan, the infamous grid road system. The Development Corporation, who were responsible for the design of Milton Keynes, were obviously incredibly inspired by modernist architecture and indeed American urban planning. Next slide, please, Mariam. I thought I'd share with you some really pretty evocative images of the city. We call it a city. We are actually not a designated city, but we call it that anyway. You'll see in the top left, that is a sort of the real manifestation of the city itself now. We also have a Cathedral of Trees. I mean, Milton Keynes is home to 22 million trees. And while it's always been sort of promoted as city of the car, it's actually one of the greenest conurbations in the UK. We have a public art collection of 260 artworks located throughout the city. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And we most recently have invited a fleet of Starship robots to join us, and they deliver both our mail and our pizzas. So you'll see them trundling around the city streets. And then in the bottom corner, we've got a picture of, again, the infamous roundabouts. I also wanted to tell you that we're very fond of anniversaries in Milton Keynes, and this year is a very important anniversary. It's the anniversary of Homeworld. Now, Homeworld was a really important housing exposition that happened for a number of reasons. One, to promote Milton Keynes as a place to live, but actually very relevant for this evening's topic of discussion. It also introduced a number of future materials to build houses, but also to think about how we can live sustainably in the future. It was absolutely ahead of its time, and it's something that we're celebrating this year, but we're also using as a jumping off point to look how Milton Keynes can again become at the forefront of building sustainably. On to the next slide, please. Thanks, Miriam. So way back in 2017, we invited a number of creative practices to come to us with some ideas for a major public art commission. This is the context, the actual site for Future Fossil, which is Oxley Park in Milton Keynes. It's one of the growth areas, and it's home to roughly 8,000 people at the moment. The brief for the commission was very much informed by two specific desirables or outcomes, I guess. One was to provide the community with a meeting place, a place to come together, a social place that they could share. And then the second point was really to encourage a new relationship to the natural world. Milton Keynes has a fantastic array of green spaces, but we kind of learned, particularly in this area of the new town, that engagement with nature was very, very low. And I think one of the main aspirations from the commissioning side of things was to encourage a new interaction with nature. So we appointed Something & Son due to their remarkable track record of delivering exceptional commissions, and particularly for engaging people in their working processes. So they went through a very in-depth research process. Next slide, please. This is a typical Oxley Park house, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Next slide, thanks, Maureen. So in terms of kind of this process of research, obviously there was a sort of an absolute desire to think about the everyday, where, you know, historically where people had come to gather. So obviously the historic Buttercross, which was always located at an intersection of trading routes, a bandstand, so again a place to come together to experience a cultural activity, and then a memorial. I think one of the things that something we're really interested in exploring was how sites can become homes for future rituals. Next slide, please. Other forms of kind of inspiration and research was absolutely the archaeological dig. I think Andy and Paul at the time happened upon a fantastic fossil in Milton Keynes Central Library, and was so excited that, you know, underneath this remarkable modernist new town, they'd found this, you know, incredible skeleton of a dinosaur that had found a new home in the Central Library. So that formed part of their thinking. Next slide, please. I think Andy's obsession with plastic. He has collected plastic, I think, for the last 20 years, and has a remarkable collection of plastic objects. But that sort of enthusiasm for plastic as a material has morphed into a real fascination with plastiglomerates. So this really curious and fascinating sort of fusion of natural materials with plastics to almost create these otherworldly stones, which are incredibly beautiful and gem-like in their own right. Next slide, please. Additionally, I think one of the other topics that he explored was really thinking about again, linking back to the new town, the Anthropocene. So this sort of understanding that we're at a point where sort of the relationship between humanity and nature is almost at this tipping point, and the relationship between the two. And again, I think one of the other really important aspects was this exploration of materiality, what materials mean, and the potential storytelling possibilities of materials. Next slide, please. So one of the aspects or elements of the research process was to really look and sort of take this idea or manifestation of the plastiglomerate and see if we could make one for ourselves. Next slide, please. So we invited a remarkable researcher and artist, Xeno Feminism, to come and deliver a series of workshops with the Oxley Park community, where we actually made some plastiglomerates together. Next slide, please. You'll see we were out in the blazing heat, long may that come back very soon, making these absolutely kind of remarkable materials just in sort of buckets from B&Q. And the participants who we kind of made these models of actually houses and embedded seeds into the plastiglomerates just to see how this new material could potentially support natural life. So this whole process, it was a 2-year research and development process, manifested itself in the final design for Future Fossil. Next slide, please. So this is an architectural render of the sculpture itself. You'll see that it's a section inspired by the typical Oxley Park house. And in sort of casting this negative form, the actual artwork will be embedded within the landscape. So essentially it will look very much as if it's landed from the future. The actual hollowed out sort of form of the house will function very much as an amphitheatre, and will house a cultural programme, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. I think, next slide, please. You'll see from the next slide, one of the really, really important elements, Andy's been working with a team of ecologists and landscape designers, and he was really, really interested in making sure that when fossil lands within Oxley Park, it almost looks like, in terms of sort of a harbinger from the future, but it almost looks like nature has begun to reclaim it already. So this entire planting scheme, which will incorporate seeds from the local area as well as indigenous plants, will almost kind of replicate this sense that nature has already reclaimed this man-made landscape. Next slide, please. And you'll see here, just to give you a bit of a sense of the scale, this on the top left is the back end of Future Fossil, as it were, and it will be absolutely this kind of greened, planted landscape. And then the render at the bottom gives you just a sense of how it will function as a sort of new public realm space to be enjoyed by the community. I think overall, I mean, Future Fossil, it is a provocation. It's asking absolutely, you know, in 10,000 years time, what will be left behind? But really it's asking us to question and to consider, I guess, our methodologies for growth, and really to think about how we are all very much implicated in making these fossils of the future, and to challenge us to sort of really explore new propositions and realities in relation to that provocation. But it won't be a static entity. I think one of the really important and really fundamental aspects of Fossil is that it will house a programme. It is for people to occupy, and we're busy putting mechanisms in place that will enable the widest possible community to use it, to programme it, to deliver whatever they want to do in it. And I think the resonances from that activity will hopefully it will almost, I think we're going to sort of touch on this a little bit later on, but in the sense, this, by having this occupation through almost a ritualization of activity within the space, we are embedding, perhaps through a kind of osmosis, as it were, this sense of a new potential, a new possibility in terms of our relationship to the natural world. I think the next slide is the final one. Oh no, we'll whiz through these just to sort of give you a sense of the scale of it. I mean, it sounds 8 meters tall. It is actually the size of a house. Next slide, please, Maroon. And that's just a sort of sense of where it is. And I think the final slide. Yes, so just including this, I think it was, you know, we've talked so much about ritual and new traditions and new possibilities. So again, you know, this is formed very much part of something that Son's thinking. And then the final slide, which I think is a question from Andy. So yeah, I think again, what the question of time, the question of what will be left behind in 10,000 years time, or indeed 200,000 years time, and exactly what role we can play in terms of influencing what that future looks like. So that gives you an overview of Future Fossil as an artwork, and I'll now hand over to my fellow speakers. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks Fiona. Sorry, I realised that I probably should have said who I was at the beginning there, but I forgot. So thank you so much for giving us an overview of the artwork. So I think we'll jump into just explaining a bit about who we've got some, you know, 2 incredible panelists joining us this evening, and I think and we're all coming from a slightly different position in terms of these themes. So I'll briefly just explain. I'm Caroline Teal. I'm the co-founder of a futures research agency called Franklin Teal. We've been running for about 12 years now. My background is I'm a designer and a design educator. I ran a master's course called Material Futures for a number of years, exploring the intersection of science, design and craft, and how we could fuse those elements to design for a more sustainable future. And now my role at Franklin Teal, we work with large corporations effectively to see how we can help them seed material innovation for a more sustainable future. And so within the themes of time and transformation, I'm completely fascinated by this work, and also I think the role of arts and culture so, you know, I think we're touching on essentially our exploring our relationship with the natural world and how this is continually evolving, and also looking at the need to think in a more long-term manner. I think we're kind of caught up in this modern day frenzy of quick wins and rapid returns, and we've often lost sight of the vastness of time and space in which we exist, you know, which is often fueled by throwaway plastics and short-termism, and particularly the way that we have very binary approaches to material. And I think what's really fascinating about this project is how it encourages us to think about sort of longer term ideas in practice that's, you know, intertwined with art and culture, which have and design that have the power to create, I suppose, new infrastructures to have these conversations that mold new mindsets and nudge potentially new behaviors. So yeah, I'm really interested in how we talk about materials, how, I suppose in a very pragmatic sense, how designers particularly think about materials, and within the confines of sitting in a very commercial environment with time and budgetary constraints, and how we can give them the tools to sort of think differently and hopefully make more meaningful decisions about the materials that we are working with on a daily basis. So now I'd just like to throw open to our incredible panelists that are joining us. So Mama D, can I invite you to, I'm not going to do that awful thing of reading a bio out loud, because I'm sure you can talk about your own experience a lot better than I can. So do you want to tell us a bit about what you do and perhaps your relationship or your perception of this topic, or these themes, time and transformation?
Okay, hi, greetings everybody. Well, I'm Mama D, and I'm descended from evidently tropical origins, twice removed. I was raised in last century's Britain, a Britain that I guess was experiencing a level of amnesia of its earlier Britishness, which meant in some ways I became a marked woman, navigating a landscape of other marked objects, beings, and spaces, which is perhaps the source of my current philosophical flexibility, perhaps. That, and I also have lived and worked in the tropics, I suppose in the capacity of being an agri-environment specialist, but to myself, somebody who had a whole lot to learn from different cultures. I am also, along with other, I suppose, marked bodies here in Britain, one of those who discuss topics ranging from climate justice through to things like Afrofuturism, a source of thinking along lesser traveled paths of the imagination, perhaps. And I think perhaps because dystopia is already present, the present of those who are on the flip side of modernity, those who constitute it, the colonized. And yet this dystopia is also projected as a possible future to those who are only now coming to terms with ideas of climate justice through an idea of the climate emergency and a limited, potentially 10 Earth years left if we don't come to our senses in time. So in navigating these times, this past and this future, perhaps my contributions may be evidence of time travel on a mix of cart, horse, and solar powered rocket. That's my short intro.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Jan, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks, Fiona and Mamadi, for those introductions and of where we're coming from in this, and some of the journeys we might take in our discussions tonight. I'm Jan Zalishevich. I'm a geologist at the University of Leicester, and I take an interest in the Earth of the very distant past, the recent past, and also the future, including the far future, going towards the projection of 10,000 years and beyond, for the things that we make, we use, and that might become the fossils of the future. I think it's great that Mamadi, you brought in the idea of climate here, because of course that and change to the Earth in general is bound up with the things that we make and we do, and that might become the future fossils. When we create a building, we use lots of energy, and that energy, of course, is what is causing the Earth to warm, the oceans to warm, and that in turn will affect the chances of the landscapes and our objects within them to become fossilized as climate change, geography changes, biology changes. And that's certainly a path to explore in that. And of course, what it means for us and what it means for different groups within us. I've always felt, as a geologist, I'm kind of stateless in time and space. And that's a perspective which may not be helpful in this time. But I guess we need to take some directions here in our discussions. So maybe one way to start is to, if I can think, one is this idea of we can look forward far more than 10,000 years. In fact, the fossil that was found that you mentioned, Fiona, of a dinosaur, an ichthyosaur, indeed a marine reptile that somebody posted up. The age of that beneath Milton Keynes would be, in about 10,000 times 10,000 years, which is 100 million years or so, which is moderately old in terms of geology. So I think we have to think of our buildings, our roads, our future fossils lasting at least that far into the future and having effect. The other thing I might just drop in here is if we think of Milton Keynes as a town replacing, let's say, natural woodland, natural forestry. In a natural forest, not very much gets fossilized. It all gets recycled, into new trees, new plants, new birds, new mammals, new mushrooms, whatever. When we build a city out of steel and concrete and plastic especially, these are terrifically hard-wearing materials which don't recycle very well and which therefore fossilize very well, rather better than average. So we might think on how good the whole business of fossilization is, for our futures, and whether we should think of designing houses and buildings that actually fossilize far less well, and that will leave less of a story about us, but may help us live through and survive in the more immediate future. So perhaps I can just leave with that and then just see where things go.
I'd love to kind of pick up on that, because it's something that we've been really exploring in the work that we're doing in the magazine that we're producing at the moment is about material speeds, and almost thinking, do we need to kind of almost think about thinking about transience as a positive thing? So can we, we seem to design buildings, for example, that always have longevity in mind, that that needs to last for a certain period of time, and usually it's about being certified or being safe or being signed off in some sense. And thinking about material speeds, as in, if we think about the very, very fast, that can perhaps be more transient in approach, or thinking about permanence and kind of and everything in between. I'm really interested in how we can, I suppose, think of materials in a much more holistic way, and particularly in relation to time. Do you think when we consider materials, when we use materials, when we talk about materials, are we considering time enough? Is it an aspect, or are we thinking more about aesthetics, about property? I'd just love you to sort of talk. You've said things in the past that have really made me think a lot about what lies beneath, and what, how we're thinking about where materials go, how we're burying them. Yeah, and just talk a bit about our relationship with time and material currently, and what you perhaps think we need to do differently. Well,
the question of what to do differently is I think, something for all all of us, and probably least of all me, in this respect. But the speed is certainly a really important point here. Fiona mentioned, the Anthropocene, this idea that we're now living in a geological epoch where we humans are calling the shots rather more than nature, physically, chemically, biologically, and we're changing the face of the planet. To leave a total new kind of structure, including these future fossils in the future. And this is now happening terrifically quickly. When we think of the speed at which technology evolves, for instance. I grew up in the days of typewriters, and Tipex and crossing out mistakes, with things like that. When I was about 20, computers appeared and I was terribly confused by them. I'm still terribly confused by them, but they've gone through numbers of generations in that time, as have all the other bits of technology we've used. And if you compare that with the thousands and millions of years over which biological organisms, communities involved, that is more like an explosion, a meteorite impact, if you like, in its effect on the planet and in its dynamics than a natural part of the Earth system. So we're doing that because it makes life better and more comfortable for us right now. But I think you're quite right. We don't really think about what's going to happen to all these amazing numbers of different things we're making. When we have, in that house in Milton Keynes, do we think what's going to happen with the bricks? Once the house is demolished, let's say in 50 years' time, what are we going to do with the UPVC windows? Those don't recycle terribly well, neither the metal nor the plastic. What is going to happen to them over, that 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years? I think these are questions that geologists, colleagues and I, are only just beginning to get to grips with, because we've only just begun to ask them. We've only just begun to realize that they're important. And of course, that interacts, of course, with all the kind of things that you and Fiona and Mama Dee were talking about. This is part of a society. The society is creating geology. And yet that geology is now rebounding upon us in various ways, in climate change, in mass extinctions, in pollution of all kinds. And by and large, I think, as you realize yourself, we don't think about the long-term perspectives, the long-term future enough. How to try and factor that in, into business, economics, planning, and so on, is a really, really big question. How do you factor that in between different communities of people within this country, between different countries? We are now tangled up in geology. There's no way out. In fact, colleagues of mine in the humanities now say that we can no longer separate nature from humanity. We're all part of it, on a planetary scale. So where from here? I leave that,
And Mama Dee, that sort of is a nice jumping off point to go back to something that you mentioned in our sort of previous conversation about this our relationship with nature, and you talked about nature being sort of the non-material that's shaping material, often the materials that we put in the landscape, but nature being the space in between you talked about, which I just thought was really beautiful. Can you tell us a bit more about your thinking around that, and how, do you think that we actually need to start really more deeply considering you know, nature as a material, as a material influencer, I suppose?
It's interesting. I think I would want to complicate, in a way, the way in which we are talking here about time and materials. You know, I think the way in which we conceive them are strongly correlated with our cultural interpretations and the relationships that we have with things and with time. Um, you know, for example, I don't know if I said then that the Yanomami people of the Amazon have this concept in which they recognize that the future is actually behind, because you can't see it and you can't predict it. So it must be out of sight. But the past is in front of us, because we have knowledge of it already. So that signs of decay, fermentation, amalgamation, such as these plasticretes, different kinds of metamorphosis and transformation, must all be forms of knowledge processing that we could anticipate as being the basis of future materials, perhaps. So what can we learn from past worlds in plural, that have existed on Earth? And, you know, are we willing to learn, recognizing that in order to learn from a vast array of previous worlds, what it might bring into challenge is this title that we've given ourselves of Homo sapiens. Are we that wise, you know? And, you know, if we want to think about, for example, this concept of colonial time, I don't know if it's something that you've come across, but it's a kind of measure that makes all kind of cultural difference appear as natural aspects of remoteness or backwardness and being stuck in the past, so that the flow of time, the progress is part of that flow of time. If you go forward, you are progressing. And it's promoted by anything that breaks down distance and local culture. So the more cultures come together to be operating in the same way, using the same kinds of things, you know, everybody uses fridges and washing machines and hoovers or whatever, then they are progressing. Progress is a movement in time from the unchanging past to the dynamic future. The future becomes a prize to be attained by movement towards the apex of modernity. But what this means is that the greater the distance from this modernity that a body or bodies, whole bodies, are located at, the closer they are to something that's quite dystopian. It's quite it's damaged. It's a damaged future, and this idea has been likened. I was reading something about sci-fi and cli-fi, and there was a Nigerian American sci-fi author, Tochi Onyebuchi, who said dystopia is already a reality of the Blacks. Yeah, and then that idea in itself is expanded upon by the author Catherine Yusof, who's written million Black Anthropocenes or None, which she talks about the bodies of those that are located. Well, she's describing the Anthropocene because it's a book about the Anthropocene, but it is represented by the bodies of those located as most distant and most expendable from the colonial modern, were effectively incorporated into the framing layers of the geology of the Anthropocene era. So about, say, 600 years ago, one can mark that, look, here are, this is when mining started to take place, yeah? And these mines were the, you know, initial kind of major interventions, because they were taking place intensively in different parts of the world. These are the major interventions where man started to change geology and became physically actually incorporated into it. So this incorporation would take place in all the various instances of mass death, from various extractivisms, minings, harsh plantation systems, the medical and scientific experimentation, and many colonial wars. In fact, a small story is something I want to share actually about that, because I was reading an account of somebody who managed to last 105 years, but who was born in slavery in Antigua. And he talked about that when the enslaved were found to be expendable, they'd used up their useful life and they wanted to just get rid of them. Often they would march them to a rocky outcrop which wasn't useful for the plantation, and they would just knock them on the head and stones would be piled on these bodies. And I noticed once upon visiting one of the islands in the Caribbean that there's a rocky area that was used for the growing of pimento seed. And I also visited a family relation that lived up in the hills, and I still, show me your farm, you know, because I'm interested in agriculture. Let me see your farm. And she took me out to this area of what I thought was just rock. What farm? Or what can you grow? But upon closer inspection, what I was witness to is that in all the kind of indentations into the rock, in all the little places where soil had collected, that she was growing things. And it made me think, you know, afterwards when reading this book, oh my goodness, is this past humans? You know, are these the bodies of people who were buried up in these rocky outcrops that now is fertilizing these farms of the present day? But you know, it just makes one think again about that, you know, that whole the recycling of materials, including the human and what the human can create, you know. So I'm also noticing, I suppose, when we're talking about trajectories of the future, that we have so many worlds. The Zapatista talk about a pluriverse, which is a space, they say, where a world in which many worlds fit. Yeah. And to think that each world has its own cosmology, its own framing, just like I spoke about the Yanomami, its own framing about what is material. Are we even separate? Are we not continuous with this term that we give nature? Yeah. And so therefore, when we're thinking about our futures or our past, should we not be thinking far more holistically about the flow of everything and the interweaving, as if trees change us as much as we change trees and where they grow? So, you know, is there another kind of way of holding this idea about transformation?
I'd love to pick up on, because I think it's fascinating the way that you completely throw the conversation open to, you know, when you're talking about even from whose vantage points are we discussing the Anthropocene. And there's a real growing, and just touching on something that you were talking about earlier about this notion that, you know, actually looking backwards is looking forwards. There's a big kind of movement within the design industry, I suppose. Sorry, my email's pinging, but I don't want to close it down because it's got some of my notes in it. There's this real kind of thirst to learn more about Indigenous wisdom, and particularly, you know, long-term thinking seems to be a very sort of zeitgeist facet of the sustainable agenda currently, but obviously that it's nothing new, as you know, nothing ever is. And I'm just really interested what your perception of, you know, how do you, so things like 7th generation thinking, for example, the empty chair practice, the idea of putting an empty, you know, as a tool, kind of putting an empty chair in a, perhaps, you know, a brainstorm sessions to represent your, you know, because within design we're often told that, you know, it's all about being human centric and having empathy or humility with the person that you're designing for. And but you know, how do we actually design for generations ahead so that we can't even anticipate, you know, their needs, their, you know, surroundings, etc. I'm really interested to hear what do you think about this sort of almost trend, I suppose, to revisit Indigenous wisdom? Do you think we should be doing that with caution, or would you celebrate that, crudely speaking?
So I think to be able to extend ourselves to different kinds of spaces, different kinds of spaces that we can't anticipate how they're actually going to be, the future. I think we also need to be able to extend ourselves laterally to the variety of people who live on the earth in the present. So to be able to accommodate all the different ways and perspectives that people hold, to be able to I don't know, I suppose deal with difference in encounter, to hear, to be able to listen, and to encourage encounters of difference so that listening can take place across different kinds of spectrum. Means that we're preparing ourselves in a way to be able to anticipate, if we understand that the future is based on the present, and our presents are, you know, extensions of our past, that we can then be able to anticipate the kinds of different kinds of the whole wide spectrum of conversations that we need to have with future generations. And I think I brought up this idea of Xeno Feminism, where, you know, there is this idea that one cannot necessarily from how things are narrated in the present so socially or biologically determine the status of different kinds of identity. And I think that's to be able to be more, to hold a greater variety of difference, means that we're more prepared for the variety that we can encounter in the future.
I just wanted to ask, sorry to Caroline, jumping in, just thinking, it's a very sort of pragmatic example, but just sort of thinking about how the necessity to embrace that as a strategy for the future might be driven by the natural world itself. I was just thinking of a friend who works for Architects Sans Frontières, and he is at the forefront of trying to come up with scenarios for future ways of living that is absolutely dealing with the, I guess, at the forefront of the challenges of climate change. You know, they are trying to house communities and work with materials within a very kind of very restricted landscape in many ways. But in terms of that sort of dialogue and conversations with the communities that they're thinking about rehousing and how they use materials to do that, what's been so interesting in talking to him is, you know, that it's informed through conversation. It is allowing that space to take place just through a pragmatic need to get these people into somewhere to live. And I just wondered whether ultimately that is being driven by the natural world, because it's you know, that's forcing this I guess this embracing of a multitude of realities. I don't know whether that's a question. I don't know.
Jan, do you want to pick up? Just throwing you, or you're on mute, sorry.
Pardon. There we are. Yes, I'm still not used to computers, you know, this year's. But yes, I mean, what struck me, you know, is the tremendous complexity that you've all demonstrated of these different, not just the different patterns of time, space, material objects, but the different ways of perception of them that we have among different communities, you know, with the, you know, time backwards and all of that. You know, these are lovely analogies, and this kind of analogy making will vary from community to community, person to person. A person might change in these kind of perceptions in his life. And when I compare, let's say, with the way the Earth works in geology, at least as we understand it as geologists, this kind of nature without humans is in some ways far simpler. We are now worried about climate change, the rise of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because of human action. Well, that kind of thing has happened before. In the past, there have been global warming events with CO2 emissions, through things like the oceans, volcanoes, melting permafrost. These are all relatively tractable. We can try and understand them. They're relatively simple. Whereas once we deal with the same kind of thing being created by human activities, which build our societies, our material culture, our buildings that we then like to fossilize, then we have this huge diversity of perspectives, all of which combines to create the same effect: a change in the atmosphere, a change in the climate. I'm not sure that geologists are very good at all at dealing with this, and this is where I go back to you to try and understand the dynamics that are changing the Earth we have to live in, to try and therefore get back to understand the geology we're making. So while on the one hand, this future fossil that is being built, displayed in Milton Keynes, has one set of explanations you can put, talking about chemistry and biology. To me, that is relatively simple. There are much more complicated, difficult questions are, what are the human decisions, perceptions that have taken all these materials from a wide variety of places and put them together? And that, I think, is what makes the current state of the Earth so fascinating. We've gone from one, if you like, set of rules, which more or less persisted, for hundreds of millions of years, up and down, to something quite different. And that's something quite different, which the future fossil is symbolizing, and which we're all now trying to get a grasp of. And I think the question of looking for these unseen pockets of time and space, the things which are hidden from us, which I think is important, which can then, of course, feed back into designing the kind of buildings and the kind of culture that we think can be sustainable or more sustainable on a longer term.
There's a question come in. I mean, we'd definitely like to invite questions for the last 10 minutes from the audience. There's a question come in building on what you're saying, Jan. Well, I suppose getting to the crux, saying on Jan's point about perceptions, is there a universal and shared simpler way to engage most humans with one issue for the shared goal of saving the planet from climate emergency, climate change? Is it, dare I ask, money?
What a good question. Because again, the question has got to the point that there are many perceptions, of climate change, its relative importance. There is, from the denial of it altogether, to thinking it is the most important issue of all, at the moment for all of us, with many in between. And certainly we need to try and find common ground to do this. And money is something we all use, we all understand up to a point. And some of the potential solutions, to climate change have involved various forms of taxation, which involve money, which we can pretty well all understand in that sense. So yes, I think, given the diversity, which you've only touched upon, and yet has shown me, even now a bigger world than I knew existed. We do need to find ways where we can all discuss it with some measure of understanding, if not always agreement.
And yeah, I'd just like to invite any further questions. Yeah, I mean, I think the point of the nitty gritty, the money issue, is an interesting one. Just going back to the kind of the site of the Future Fossils piece of art, because I think, you know, there's a messy kind of interconnection, isn't there? I'm very interested in the built environment and the relationship it has on our physical and mental well-being. And we often know that, you know, our spatial environment has a huge impact on us. And yet we still build spaces that have, you know, smaller windows and lower ceilings. And so, you know, I suppose it's not just about material, is it? It's the relationship between material, spatial, you know, and economics. And unfortunately, often these things, you know, come down to the economics. We had another question actually from the same, a bigger question, saying, what do we think were the most significant future trend in the human relationship with our biosphere? Are we destined to select for a lower but more anthropogenically functional diversity? Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, again, a big question, like a hand grenade, you know, thrown at us.
Yeah.
To have a look. And before that, I had a question for you and you know, for Mamadi in that. But if I can quickly reply, the biosphere is clearly changing very quickly. Almost whether we like it or not, most people would like it not, you know, to change and to retain our diversity of animals and plants, and so we can, you know, enjoy David Attenborough programs in the future, knowing that that kind of thing would always be around. But alas, you know, species are going extinct. Species invasions are taking place across the whole planet to change the whole nature of life. Part of that is, of course, what we grow to eat and keep to eat, you know, which is now a very large part of nature. So it is happening. But the question is more, how can we make it happen in a way which is better for life generally, which probably therefore will mean it's better for us as well. So what is how can we design? Again, coming back to this question to you, what are the design issues? Can you design the biosphere of the future? You know, does that go into the kind of questions that you and, you know, the people you work with ask? And, you know, is that a kind of conversation, let's say, that, you know, Mamadi would hold when she's having discussions?
Or Mamadi, you're on mute.
Can I add an element to that? Sorry, Caroline. In terms of thinking about design and designing of, because we are talking about biology relating to biology of all sorts, including human biology and its interrelationships with what we perhaps, you know, we've been at school to think about as non-living life, yeah, non-living elements of the earth, you know, the rocks or you know, the earth, the soil itself. But we've understood that these things also have their own cycles, right? And they become us and we become them in many ways. Our body also has a mineral element, which is continuous with a carbon cycle, a nitrogen cycle, and these kinds of things. But also our thoughts, our dreams, our ideas, our ambitions as different kinds of humans across the whole face of the earth, how do these things also get incorporated into a design? How do we, I mean, somebody asked a question about well, biodiversity, but I would say that there's probably some other word that incorporates not only the biosphere, but the kind of I don't know if it's a new sphere, a sphere of thought and dreaming and believing, of knowledge, that also needs to be woven into design. Have you got ideas about how you approach that?
There's a question here actually that relates to that, from one of Jan's ex-students, saying, mentioned the idea of changing materials for buildings so they won't have an impact 1,000 years in the future. However, how do you suggest overcoming the current reluctance in the construction industry to change this when they themselves have to consider cost, serviceability and legal responsibility when constructing developments? Would a move towards an increased recyclability of materials be more realistic? And I think that's the really fascinating place that we are in design, is that it's, you know, systems design is completely interconnected to, you know, the design of a building or the design of a product, in that, yeah, we currently, so one of the super materials that's being, you know, really heralded as a breakthrough potentially is mycelium, or, you know, mushroom based material that's being explored for anything from aviation applications to footwear and to housing, architectural material. And one of the biggest problems is that it's a transient material. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't have longevity built into it, and therefore our current architectural systems are all about, you know, certifying that material is going to last for X number of years. But what if we didn't have to? What if we could take that on ourselves? What if we could take certification individually and say, yes, I know that this is only going to last for, you know, a couple of years. This is going to be my transient home that I'm going to live in for this period, and then it's going to, and when we start to think of it in that way, then you start thinking about transient, you know, dwellings or cities, or and kind of rethinking. And the problem is that you know, the design of an object or a building is completely intertwined with the infrastructure, and so we have to reassess, you know, all of those elements together. But obviously increased recyclability, if we think about those speeds, that it doesn't just have to be, you know, very short life or very long life, but very you know, a very long life, but in several very quick lives, so that things can remain constantly in closed loops. So yeah, I mean, I think yeah, everything is interconnected in terms of object and service, and there needs to be a kind of an openness to embrace, and I believe that's only going to come through legislation or economic win effectively. And you know, the legislation element is obviously completely entwined with politics, and quite difficult to get to at this point in time. But you know, I think the exciting thing from my perspective is the level of innovation. I hate the word because it's, you know, sort of encompasses all and nothing, but the exciting material developments that are going on essentially, but how we can pull them into being actually adopted and applied is the biggest challenge from my vantage point at this point. How do we get them into being used essentially? I think we might be nearing, we've slightly run over, so nearing wrap up. Is there any other final comments that our panelists wanted to? Oh, we've got 15 minutes left. Oh, sorry, I thought we were finishing at 8:30. Am I wrong there?
We have another.
I think it's 1:45.
Oh, it's 2. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, brilliant. Sorry.
I want to make a comment perhaps about plastic.
Yeah.
And thinking about plastic, not only just as a material, but also as something that's a kind of, I don't know, a lesson to us as well concerning things about imbalance or injustice. You know, if we imagine that plastic is the end result of us as humans probing deep into our grandmother's skin, you know, scarring her badly in the process, siphoning out old blood from hard to reach veins deep in her body, never once asking if the inaccessibility to that blood itself was not a sign to stop and to go deeper within our own selves, to look for more sustainable sources of power. And now we might navigate across her vast body, identifying all the signs of our folly. But whilst we do that, can we do so with the humility of the child whose errors have been pointed out? Or will we stubbornly refuse to listen and prefer rather to forge new selves with the mind refashioned objects created out of our own limited horizons, because we feel we have nothing to learn from those who have been before, those elders? So we're looking at cyber futures, which, if we were to go by the sci-fi, plastic and metal still play a major role. What have we learnt? It's a question to people who are present.
Yes, that was a very nice series from that nice question, then to the practicalities, that we point out, Caroline, and then of course, what's is at the heart and root of all this is how it fits into our minds, spirits, souls, whatever, because that is driving that. I mean, in terms of if you like, both of those, I wonder whether one test that might be applied, in all of these discussions, very simple one, is that in the designing of our new lives, new buildings, new homes, new structures, you might have a kind of fossilizability test. So the more easily something becomes fossilized, probably the more damage it does to our environment, to us, to our children, and so on, because it's going to hang around for a long time. Plastic, as you said, Mamadi, is almost the icon of that. It's something we make and use almost without thinking, and it's become ubiquitous. But it's going to make many, many, many fossils, and on the way, it's going to do a lot of damage, which I think is the key point. In the far future, it's no problem. In the near future, it's a very big problem. But the far future is a test of its of how much of an issue of it is now. So, I mean, Caroline, do you see that as a kind of test that could be used in hard-nosed business conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just sort of bringing it back to this sculpture that seems to sort of make a point of both our past and our future, but also sort of bringing together this role of human-made material and nature, and actually sort of looking at the power play. I suppose I think it'd be really interesting to challenge the commercial sector more to think about actually what's nature's role in the things that we design, as in when we put them out, how, particularly in the architectural realm, do we consider enough actually? Do we model, for example, I don't know this, I've worked with some architectural students, but more on a conceptual level, do we actually model how nature is going to influence this over time? I mean, I think we do on a short-term perspective in terms of aesthetics. We talk about patina, and we talk about, we specify a particular wood because it's going to go a beautiful silver, but do we actually, maybe we model? I live near the Olympic Park here in Stratford, and we go there all the time, and the thing that strikes me the most is that they've created these incredible wind tunnels where you can literally almost get blown away just by putting buildings next to each other. So we do it from that sort of pragmatic perspective, but do we actually invite nature into the design process enough? Maybe I don't know if that's something that you've ever explored with your students in terms of, or anything that you've in any of your work, Mamadi, that you've explored. But do we actually kind of think of nature as a co-creator enough?
Possible, but well, I think we are beginning to explore that. And I think it's a relatively recent thing, as you are in business, beginning to talk about these things. And it's clearly important, and clearly we have to do more of it. And I think part of the trouble is that most of the stuff that we throw away, we kind of stuff out of sight and bury. So out of sight and out of mind, but certainly still in existence and still active for decades, centuries, millennia in the future. And I think the beauty of the sculpture and the whole idea is it's taking this thing out that's usually buried somewhere and putting it where everybody can see it and think about it, and even see what's going to be happening to it, over a couple of winters or a couple of summers, how different bits are going to change. Are different kinds of lichen or mosses or grasses going to grow on different parts of it? Will they grow on the plastic or only on the brick? And this is something that, even the school kids can see and make projects on what is happening to the sculpture. Oh, there's another bit gone. What's going to happen to it? And I think that's, we have to think about these things because it, as we've all said, it's part of our wider futures, in this. And I think to draw attention on it, can, if you like, make it more, something more respectable for, for businesses and people to talk about.
And
It also talks a lot.
Oh, sorry.
We're all so excited to go, Mehdi.
No, I just said I have great hopes for this sculpture and hoping that as there is this unfolding learning from it over time, that people might think, well, homes, of course, are not just made of concrete. Homes, as opposed to houses, are made up of, lots of things that degrade at different rates. And wouldn't that also be interesting to watch, the kitchen utensils, how they degrade, how they morph over time, and maybe even foods and, clothes and all the other elements which make up a home. This is our impact, this is our live footprint over time that, school children and other people can come and see and contemplate. And perhaps what the sculpture will do as it evolves will encourage other places in different localities, different ecologies, to experiment in the same way, to come to an understanding of our human footprint on the planet, and encourage conversations around that.
I think not to speak for Andy, obviously, but I think that's a beautiful summary of their aspiration for the sculpture, and in a way, slightly sort of with my civic hat on, it is a sort of provocation to the civic authorities to say, I mean, going back to that point, in order to make change in respect of a design process, a planning process, absolutely on the ground, it has to be really very much driven from that civic vision as well, to put the mechanisms in place to allow for that to happen. I was just thinking back to a visit to Almere in Holland. I can never remember the name of the place, but there's a patch of land that's been given over to communities to self-build, to design their own houses and build them. And what's really interesting, there is a house there that was absolutely designed and built just to last for 10 years. That was completely right from the outset, that the owner's aspiration, that they then wanted to build again with the materials and just to constantly to rethink. So yes, it's a really there's a fantastic opportunity there, and I think the sculpture hopefully will act as a provocation for those conversations.
Yes, I fully agree, and it would be great if in 10 years' time there could be a follow-up sculpture made out of Caroline's mycelium building structures, and we'll see how that changes.
Yeah, I think what I love about it is the kind of challenging of aesthetics that we're seeing, that there's this sort of challenging of what's beautiful and almost and the playing with control, what do we have control over and what do we not? Because I think design is so much about control, and what's so nice to see is the sort of almost removal of the ego and shifting towards allowing a bit an interest in the process and an interest in the story over the look, over the aesthetic. And yeah, I think there's some really interesting things sort of coming in a sort of anti-aesthetic vein.
Yes, I think the story is all important. You know, we're great storytellers,
Yeah.
Even when we think we're not being, you know, but the story is almost what we live by. So let's hope.
Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. So I'll just end by saying thank you so much, Mama D and Jan and Fiona, for joining the conversation this evening, and thank you very much to everybody. I'm sorry it's so anonymous, and it's a shame that we can't see you all and have a more kind of intimate conversation, but such as, you know, the times that we're living in. But yeah, great to be able to air some of these thoughts, and hope that it leaves everybody with something to ponder for the rest of the evening. So and thank you to the Future Fossil Project for having us, and hope to be able to engage with you again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.